Well, I hope you've had your shredded wheat for breakfast, a few of them, and that you're reasonably awake tonight, because we're about to cover 4 chapters of the Bible in one sitting within about 35 minutes. And we bring this summer series on the life of David to an end as we do so. And what holds the narrative together is the way that each of the main characters, Saul, who is the king on the way out, and David, who is the king on the way in, and Jonathan, the man who's caught in the middle, how those 3 characters manage to cope when, for each of them differently, life falls apart. The strapline for tonight's talk. And of course, that is the experience of people the world over. We've been hearing from Suzanne very dramatically how in parts of the world, people's lives are falling apart. It may even be what you are facing this evening as you come in to Lansdowne. I don't know, several things may be happening in your life, and you just feel that things are spinning out of control, and you are looking at an emotional car crash, and there's no way to avoid the impact. Now, we've already met Saul and David and Jonathan before, of course, if you've been with us on recent Sunday evenings. And as things come to a dramatic conclusion tonight, each of them has very obvious reasons for feeling that life is imploding. David, because he's on Saul's wanted list, and he's already experienced something of the violent, irrational paranoia of the king. Jonathan, Saul's son, but David's best friend, his life is impossible because his commitment to David brings him into direct conflict with his father and creates major family complications as a result. And then there's Saul. Saul, who is living with the knowledge that God has rejected him as king of Israel. But he's reluctant to step aside so that God's new man can come to the throne. And what we see happening as the plot in these chapters unfolds is that whereas when life falls apart for David and for Jonathan, they step up and they grow as people, Saul is overwhelmed by life's collapse, and we watch him wither and shrivel and eventually die tragically. They say, don't they, that the real test of a leader is not prosperity but adversity. I think that can apply much more widely than to those of us in leadership. Suffering, tragedy, difficulty can either make you better or bitter. The tough circumstances of our lives can either drown us or they can somehow develop us. The question we want to explore tonight is, well, what makes the difference? Why in the chapters we cover does David and Jonathan step up to the mark, but Saul shrivel away? The answer seems to lie in the way in which each of these characters deals with the prospect of the future, with what God is doing and bringing about. Saul resists that future, David waits for the future, and Jonathan embraces it. Now, I guess without running too straight a line from the specifics of this unique period of biblical history to the generations and generalities of our lives, there is an overlapping principle. I think it's this. Those who respond positively to the unfolding of God's plan for their lives, however hard the implications of that plan may sometimes be, they are those who will remain standing when life falls apart. Let me show you how that principle works out in the character development of these 3 very different men. Firstly, when life falls apart, we find Jonathan embracing the future. Jonathan saw what was coming, didn't he? He grasped that God was doing something in the life of David, the shepherd boy and the giant slayer. In fact, before anyone else, apart from the prophet Samuel, Jonathan sees the royal crown on David's head. In fact, as we examined last week from chapter 18, Jonathan enters into a bond of friendship with David. We call it a covenant. And to symbolize this loyal love, Jonathan, remember, takes off his robe and gives it to David, along with his tunic and his sword, his bow and his belt. the crown prince of Israel giving up his rights to the royal future in order that God's purposes would be fulfilled in the life of someone else. It takes a very, very big person to act like that, to recognize that they are not the future, but someone else is, and that they need to step aside to make way for that future to happen. And as time passed and David's popularity in Israel grew, Jonathan knew that his own future role as Saul's heir to Israel's throne would never come about. He knew that God was not in that. And because he knew that God was not in that, he was okay about it. And he got with a plan. He didn't rebel, he didn't get the hump and kick out, even though it massively complicates his life. He welcomes the future. And actually, as we see from chapter 20, where our reading began, he sacrifices his own future for God's plan. Thinking about this, is it not the case that there are some decisions that we are called to make in life? There are some commitments that we are called to follow through on, and they may result in great difficulty for us. We may even feel that we have been robbed of what we deserve in that future, the recognition, the respect, the honor, which could have been ours if things had been left just as they were. But we know deep down that this is not God's plan for us. He's something else for us to do, another role to fulfill. And the humility of Jonathan was such that he ended up promoting and protecting the very person who was going to take the limelight from him, the one who would, in that sense, usurp him and deny him the title, Your Majesty. But when life fell apart for Jonathan, he didn't mind, because he was secure in who God had called him to be and what God had called him to do. Jonathan's identity was not ultimately, you see, in his status, but in his service for God. The great musician and composer Leonard Bernstein was once asked, which is the hardest instrument in the orchestra to play? And he replied, second fiddle. I can get lots of first violinists, but to find a really good second fiddle, that's rare. And that was Jonathan. He learned to play second fiddle well, so that when his life seemingly collapsed, he carried on playing his part. He knew what was required of him. I guess it's true to say that every organization, every group of people needs a Jonathan. More than one. We need team players, second fiddles, people who are great at making others sound good. That is a superb personal quality. Now, just see how Jonathan plays that part in chapter 20. As it opens, David is worried about Saul's intentions towards him. Saul, as we know, has already tried to kill David, his spear missing the target. So David has understandably been scared away from the royal court. But what does David do at that point? How does David survive when his world is imploding? Where does David go? Well, he goes to his best friend, Jonathan. He needs to reaffirm the covenant they'd made together back in chapter 18. David may well be on the run, but he knows where to hide. For in David's disintegrating world, there is still one space of sanity. There, in Jonathan's loyal love, he would find a refuge. True friends offer that refuge to others, don't they? Friendship that is significant and meaningful creates a hiding place for others to run into. We give people security in uncertain times. For Jonathan had made promises to David, and he would keep them. And it is to those promises that David appeals there in verse 8. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord." And Jonathan also appeals to their covenant together. In verse 14, "But show me," says Jonathan to David, "show me unfailing kindness, like that of the Lord, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." Of course, in that personal statement of commitment, Jonathan is telling us that this quality of devoted, steadfast love flows, in fact, through the very heart of God. Show me the unfailing kindness like that of the Lord. Jonathan, in other words, is only reflecting to David what God is like in his character, God's faithfulness and dependable kindness. For this is not merely a description of David and Jonathan's relationship. No, this is how God relates to us. God has made a covenant with us. He has made promises to us, promises that he will keep, come what may. Therefore, when you or I are confused or in trouble, when your world is collapsing and your life uncertain, we can run to the one who's made a friendship pact with us. For David, it was Jonathan. For us, it is Jesus. The pact was sealed by the death of God's Son. Could God make it any clearer than the cross? When we need to find God's faithful love, we'll discover it there in Jesus at the cross, a security for uncertain times. But we also discover in Jonathan's love a loyalty in very unusual circumstances. Look again at verse 15. Jonathan says to David, "Do not ever cut off your kindness from my family." Don't kill my family, in other words. It made no sense for David to promise that to Jonathan in the culture, that he wouldn't kill him or his relatives when he came to the throne. That was unusual in the contemporary context, because the culture said, you got rid of your predecessor's family, you remove all possible future threats to your power base in the land. That is the culture of Mugabe and Assad and Hussein and King Saul, who screams at his son later in the chapter there in verse 30 when he finds out whose side Jonathan is on. Read these words from verse 30 with me. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you've sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother, the one who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die." But covenantal love does not respond the way culture does. That's the point. Jonathan sees here what his father cannot and does not want to see. The fact is, Jonathan is not on anyone's side. He is living for the kingdom, God's kingdom, and God's king. And he was going to put that kingdom first, even at the cost of his father's goodwill towards him and family harmony. Somehow, you get the feeling, don't you, that Jonathan would have understood the words of Jesus. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, the expression hate there is the colorful Semitic way of expressing a life priority, not an emotion. Says Jesus, if anyone comes to me, then he is going to experience a new life priority. My kingdom, my glory, the honor of God. You see, the Christian faith on the lips of Jesus teaches that true life does not consist in securing, as Saul says to Jonathan there, you and your kingdom. That is not in what true life consists, getting my way or making my mark. No, true life consists, according to Jesus, in reflecting covenant love. For in such a world, life does not consist in achieving your goals, but in fulfilling your promises. My friends, isn't that what in sickness and health means? Where in the devotion of one marriage partner to the other, they care for the one who develops some severe illness and maybe dementia sets in and life falls apart. That is covenantal love. And love is not often glamorous. It is commitment. It is love where it hurts. It is making and keeping promises. That is not to say that love is unemotional and free from pain. Look at what appears to be the final farewell between these two blood brothers, Jonathan and David, there in the final paragraph of chapter 20. After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we've sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me." Jonathan has had to bring the awful truth to David about his father Saul's irrational anger and determination to kill him. And so here they both realize that this is the end, more than likely, of their friendship. David has no alternative. He must go. Actually, this is not the last time that we see Jonathan and David together. Their friendship has one more poignant episode before it's completed in the biblical record. And that happens a few chapters later. It's the next little section that was read to us earlier in chapter 23. So I'll save my comments about that incident until we've covered in more detail the way that David is being described in the narrative sequence. You see, if Jonathan manages his world falling apart by embracing the future, David handles his broken world by waiting for the future. Waiting for the future, that is the dominant feature of David in these chapters. He is a king in waiting. He knows that. But he doesn't try to engineer the future. He patiently waits for it. And it must have been hard for him to do that, because as chapter 23 opens, David is at one of the lowest points of his life. Look then at chapter 23 with me. He's lost his job as court musician and army commander. He's been separated now from his wife, his family, and home. He's isolated. His closest friend, Jonathan, and his trusted counselor, prophet Samuel, have gone. And then, in chapter 21 that we didn't read from, in the Philistine city of Gath, in order to hide his identity, David has had to pretend insanity. He dribbles down his beard. He scratches on the walls of the gates of Gath. And then, after an escape in chapter 22 to the cave of Adullam, he is joined by a bunch of misfits and dropouts and depressives. And that's where we meet him in chapter 23. David is a refugee on the ragged edge of despair. He's surviving on scraps of food and comfort in the wilderness. Yeah, it's true. David's world is falling apart. There are 3 great wilderness stories in the Bible. There is the 40 years that Moses led Israel, the 40 days that Jesus was tested in the desert, and then here these unknown months that David spent on the run from King Saul. Take a wide-angled lens on this for the moment. It seems to me that everybody who has anything significant to do with God, anything truly life-changing, will spend some time in the wilderness. Now, there are occasions when that wilderness is nothing more than emotional and physical exhaustion. But there are times when the wilderness is far more significant and far deeper and prolonged than that. You know, it's hokum, it's nonsense that says everyone who has faith has an easy ticket to ride, that no one's marriage fails, that no one dies from cancer, that no one suffers from acute depression, that no one is unbearably lonely. And yet, as we see from David's experience, the wilderness does not have to mean a wasted life. But often it means a waiting life, a training ground for the future. And we pick up the story of chapter 23 there in verse 14. David stayed in the desert strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. Interesting. For David, the wilderness is full of God, not Saul. And yet Saul has committed vast amounts of his men to being all over the place hunting for David. Yet in the wilderness, David experiences the protection of God. For Saul, with all of his army and his intelligence resources available to him, isn't able to lay a finger on David. David experiences God's protection, but also the refugee David in the wilderness experiences God's provision. And it comes in the form of his best friend, Jonathan. Ironic, isn't it? Saul, with all his power, couldn't track David down, but on his own, Jonathan finds him. And it's Jonathan who helps David rediscover strength in God. That's what the text of verse 16 observes. Read it with me. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. That beautiful moment. And I like that. Jonathan wasn't making their friendship the be-all and end-all of David's life. No, he knows that David needs something more than that, more than his company. David needs to get a grip on God in the wilderness. He knew that David was in danger of losing sight of that future and the role that God has for him, which is why he says in verse 17, as the reading continues, "Don't be afraid, David. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." This was a crisis moment for David. He was at risk in the wilderness of either bailing on his future and returning to a simpler life as a shepherd, or he was in danger of developing that murderous spirit of retaliation to get even with Saul, the man who was despising the best that was in him. And Jonathan's friendship rescues David from both. From abandoning his goals on the one hand and resorting to anger on the other. Jonathan helped David to be a man who waited for the plan of God and the timetable of God. He goes to David and helps his best friend find strength in God. That is what Christian friends do. They put an arm on the shoulder of a struggling believer, and above everything else, they remind them where their hope lies. They point them to the eternal refuge. They tell them to run to God. That's what Christian friends do to other believers in Jesus. You know, there are different kinds of people who play a part in our lives, aren't there? Some draw from us, others give to us. Some inspire us and, well, some tire us. Gordon MacDonald, an American pastor whose personal world imploded a few years back now, he wrote a book on the back of his experiences about the different kinds of relationships each of us has and needs in life. The book was called Rebuilding Your Broken World. And in the book, MacDonald identifies categories of people who were part of his landscape. He calls them VIPs, obviously very important people, and VRPs, which for him were very resourceful people, and then VDPs, they were the very draining people. Says MacDonald, there are certain people in my world whose company invigorates me, and when they leave, I'm full of resolve, ideas, and intentions. There are also people in my world whose presence exhausts me. And when they leave, I am ready for a long, long nap. Some bring joy wherever they go. Others bring joy when they go. And I guess Jonathan was a VRP, a very resourceful person in David's life. He refreshed him. He energized him for the next bit of the wilderness journey. He encouraged him to stick with the plan and look to God. Maybe, folks, your world is falling apart. It's a crisis moment. And you need, at that moment, the right kind of friends. The sort who will point you in the right direction. Who will keep you accountable to God and your calling. And the direction in which you should be heading as a Christian. I say this very, very emphatically. Choose your friends carefully. They can make all the difference in the wilderness. You see, in and of itself, the wilderness makes nothing happen in our lives. It's what we do with the wilderness environment which is the key. For the other main character in our chapters, who was also there in the wilderness, spending months running around in the deserts and the caves, he was Saul. Saul and David share the same wilderness, although they never meet until right at the very end of our sequence. But look what happens to Saul in the wilderness. It narrows him and embitters him, whereas in David's life, the wilderness broadens him and deepens him and changes him for the better and opens him to the fact that God is with him. Some of David's greatest psalms were written out of the context and content of these wilderness chapters. But all we've got recorded from Saul's life is his angry vendetta, which leads him, tragically in chapter 22, to order the massacre of his own people. So let's deal briefly and in closing with the characterization of Saul. And chapter 24, that chapter where David and Saul finally come face to face, is where Saul's story, for now, reaches that rather awful finale. If Jonathan handles the future by embracing it, and if David handles the future by waiting for it when his world is falling apart, then Saul is the one who, when his world is falling apart, looks at the future and fights against it. And that's our third strap, resisting the future, waiting for it, embracing it, and now finally in Saul's life, resisting it. By the end of our passage, Saul is a wreck of a man. He's driven by conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. And as we see him towards the beginning of chapter 24, it seems that his only purpose in life is now to kill David. That's all he's living for, to kill David. So eaten up with jealousy and insecurity is he that everything he does and thinks is driven by his obsession with David. David, the man he knows in his heart of hearts, God has chosen to succeed him. Oh, but Saul won't admit it. and he refuses to see it. All the other people in the narrative of these chapters can see that David is God's man for the future, including Jonathan, his own son. But whereas Jonathan reads that future correctly and comes to terms with it, the wave of the future breaks Saul as a person. And that's what we see taking place in chapter 24. Saul disintegrates before our very eyes. It's a tragic and all too familiar story of those who know the truth but don't want to live by it, who think that the normal rules don't apply to them. People who make a series of foolish decisions in an attempt to maneuver the agenda of their life to get what they want, who don't like God's will and plan and decide instead to construct their own. People who know what they have to do and yet stubbornly refuse to do it. You see, for Paul to admit that the crown belongs to David goes to the very core of his personal identity. Here's how he is brought to acknowledge in the end that the game is up. It begins in 24 in a very basic sort of way. We didn't read this in the commentary. Saul is out hunting for David as usual, and he needs to go to the bathroom. So he uses a cave in the En-Gedi desert to relieve himself, not knowing that right at the back of the cave is where David and his men are hiding. And they, of course, think that this is David's best opportunity. So they whisper to David in the darkness of the cave in verse 4, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." But true to character, David is not going to rush the future. Though his arch enemy is right there on his own and vulnerable to attack, he will not kill him. Instead, he cuts off a bit of Saul's robe and then runs after Saul outside the cave and confronts him with the evidence that the king has never been willing to see. David has always been a loyal subject. He's always served the king. He's never been part of a rebellion, verse 9. Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you've seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. This is all part of David's final speech to Saul. And it causes Saul for the first time publicly to acknowledge what in his clearer moments he's always known about himself and about David. Here it comes in verse 16. Is that your voice, David? You are more righteous than I. You've treated me well. I've treated you badly. You've just told me now of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you didn't kill me. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. It's a pathetically honest confession in the end. At last, Saul says what everybody else has been saying: David is the future. You see, Saul knows that he has failed to be deep down what he wanted to be, a man after God's own heart. And he knows that David is such a man. But he struggles to accept what that means for him. How can he, King Saul, relinquish power but still have purpose in life? You see, for Saul to admit that the crown belongs to David and not him is to raise the question, if he is not king, then who is he? Who am I? Asks Saul. And the remaining chapters of 1 Samuel describe the painful failure of Saul to answer that question and finish well. He never finds peace with himself or God, and the book closes, as you may know, with King Saul taking his own life. David, on the other hand, as we leave his story for now, will continue to wait for God's time. He's learned an important lesson, that when life falls apart, God is the only one who can help us put life together again. And he may well use a friend like a Jonathan in our lives to encourage us, he will definitely use the wilderness experience to develop us. For what does the Apostle Paul say in the New Testament, book of Romans? Suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. The hope of God working all things together for our good. In the wilderness too, when life is falling apart. And our good is not that we will necessarily be happy or comfortable. Our good is that the character of Christ will be formed in us. Christ in us, the hope of glory. For that, my friends, is God's ultimate plan. Glory. The glory of heaven. Hope. There is a hope that burns within my heart. That's our closing song for this evening. So as the musicians come to take their place, let's reflect upon that hope that drives us to God's glorious future. That's the plan. And God wants to work in us character. And that character will produce hope. And that hope will not disappoint us. It's a hope that will stand the test of time. So let's sing this together.